Welcome back, everyone. So I'm going to go through this as quickly as I can. I might have to split this into two different videos. There will be some of the transcript in the description, as well as a few links to some Gothic songs. And I also included a song that isn't Goth, but I still really like it. It's by the Sneaker Pimps, but I'm going to try and get through this. So the question is, the things that I'm about to talk about, the things that I'm about to propose, is this freedom? When certain personalities or political positions that exist on the right propose things like a Christ-based theocracy, I have to ask, is this freedom? Let's take a look at some of the more extreme claims from some of the more extreme positions these people take. Depending on the type of alt-right position the person is on, depends on their position on the particular matter. So please keep that in mind. On the topic of homosexuals, many of them want the LGBT community to go back in the closet. Some think we should go back to treating homosexuals as though it were a mental disorder and go back to such things as conversion therapy. Possibly the most extreme position are the ones who want LGBT people to be put to death, many of which compare LGBT people to that of pedophiles. Since there are so many positions, let's just take one position to make things less complicated. Let's look at specifically the sort of Christo-fascist position. The Christo-fascist position claims that being a homosexual is not involuntary, but a choice, of which they view as degeneracy. Their position very much so argues that homosexuals are on the same level as pedophiles, and the punishment for the act of sodomy should be death. They also advocate against religious secularism and push for Christian-based government. The reason I do not call it a theocracy, although some do advocate for that, but many will advocate for the constitution, or the continuation of our constitutional republic, but only as a Christian-based society. Some, such as ethno-nationalists, will advocate for a constitutional republic that is not only Christian-based, but also based on the ethnic group of white people. So then we are at the juxtaposition, or the crux, which is how, in what interpretation, is this actually freedom and not a violation of rights, liberties, and freedoms? The claim is that the individual's freedom to self-expression is oppressive to their ilk and way of life, oppressive towards them as a collective. Let's dichotomize the idea of ending secularism for the sake of one unilateral religious belief. Anti-secularism is a negation of religious freedom in and of itself, as it does not allow for other religious beliefs other than the approved secularism, or the approved. Secularism is a pro to freedom, as you have the right to your religion and to live your life as you see fit. Where it becomes perceivably oppressive to the theocratic type is that they must then tolerate religious views that are not their own. This is a very authoritarian stance, and indicative of severe tribalism or collectivism. The words uniformity and conformity come to mind, both of which are a negation of freedom And that in the aspect, they are devoid of individualized self-expression and freedom to self-expression itself. Is asking for tolerance a form of oppression and antithetical to the notion of rights, liberties, and freedoms? I would say no, as this is a behavioral ask from society to keep some level of civility and social cohesion. I would also say no because under secularism, while you may not rule by your religious position, you are promised to be able to keep it. Another way to look at this is the fact that under theocratic perspective, it's not eradicating other religious. Another way to look at this is the fact that under theocratic perspective, it's not eradicating other religious positions. It is actively suppressing them and oppressing them. Anyone who does not hold the status quo position are not even being asked to tolerate or respect another religious position or belief. They are being told to capitulate, or X consequence will happen. The idea is if you uphold ultimate authoritarian control over society and the way it functions, this will eradicate any kind of deviance from the proposed social order. This is not the case. As shown through human history, it's that no matter how oppressive the dictatorship is, insurgency and countercultures still occur almost in higher numbers. It would seem the one thing these people cannot understand is that there are positions and ways of life or philosophies that you cannot stop humans from doing, thinking, and acting on. Totalitarianism does not rid society of the problem, it merely brushes it under the carpet, so to say, while causing very real psychological and physical harm to those that do not fit the mold of the status quo. They do not cease to exist. They just go into hiding. We don't have to do much to see how this works. We can look at the Victorian age and how Queen Victoria viewed homosexual acts. Okay. If you did not know, pay attention, because this is a really interesting piece of historical education. Queen Victoria had different views regarding male and female homosexual acts, and what those acts were specifically. Victoria changed the law for oral homosexual acts between males from a death sentence to life imprisonment, which at the time was considered to be very progressive, and that society at the time, or in that society, in that specific society, in that very specific time. She also made actual anal penetration to be a crime punishable by death, but only amongst male homosexuality specifically. When asked about her laws in regards to male homosexuality and omitting female homosexuality, Her response was that no such laws need to exist for females, because females would never do such a thing. Man, so fucking parched. Okay. Basically, under Queen Victoria, it would be perfectly legal for someone to act on female homosexuality, and female homosexuals as well as heterosexuals would both be permitted to engage in anal or oral sex. Literally, the only laws on homosexuality pertain to males and males alone. Did this eradicate male homosexual behavior? Of course not. And instead, we ended up with a great poet like Lord Byron, whom was exiled by Queen Victoria due to his social status. The reason he wasn't put to death was because of his social status, and why he was exiled instead. Did heterosexuals and female homosexuals not participate in oral and anal sex? Again, no. They still participated in such acts unabated. What does this have to do with secularism? And I think that is a valid question. I choose to use her as an example, as she was puritanical. She was a puritanical queen that sought to make a very sexually puritanical society, and to no avail. It was all based off of a theocratic belief. The point is, even though oppression and suppression or even through oppression and suppression, it did not actually stop the social behavior. And in fact, due to the very sexual puritanical society, it created rebellion, which had the opposite effect than that which she desired. People became more promiscuous than they would have otherwise. This is the exact same thing that will happen if secularism is not observed. Without secularism, atheism will still exist in secret, just as it did before. In other time periods of anti-secular societies, that was supposed to be one. I should have proofread this first. I didn't do that. Without secularism, atheism will still exist in secret, just as it did before in other time periods of anti-secular societies. And that includes the entirety of Europe. Pagans will still exist just as they did many centuries ago, as the Catholic Church clinched its draconian crackdown on the so-called heathens. The only true thing that will be different under secularism is they will not be beat, murdered, tortured, oppressed, and suppressed. They exist no matter if secularism exists under the law or not. With secularism, they exist without... With secularism, they exist. Without secularism, they still exist. Then the question becomes, what is the difference then? I really think that would be self-evident. And then there are some sub-questions or micro-questions to the macro. Do others' religious beliefs cause a victim via violence or physical or psychological harm? As long as their belief or beliefs are not impinged upon others, I'd say no. But there may be an aspect of personal harm, i.e. self-flogging. There may also be an aspect of unintentional harm, i.e. stagnation of exploring truth or reality. Are these harms relevant harms to consider? No, as it would be a significant reduction of harm to society as a whole, with the lack of discrimination resulting in violence and up to the cause of murder. The current standing theology prescribed and dictated onto the population does more physical and mental harm than the deficit of secularism itself. Personally, as an anti-theist, I support secularism in the hopes that one day people of their own accordance will come to the conclusion that gods and God do not exist, and life is not eternal. This cannot be achieved via dictation, and must happen of a person's individual free will. Even though this may take time that is beyond humans' ability to remain in existence in their totality, it is important this happens at some point, as religious belief ultimately leads to indoctrination and a stifle of free thinking. Theology has a negative effect on many individuals and society, with persistent appeals to authority and appeals to tradition that make arbitrary guidelines to life that stifle individuality, customs, and strange social etiquettes that really make no sense at all. Still, I submit that secularism, a choice to religious freedom, is more important than trying to force the will of the individual and the people of any given society. In essence, it is verifiably true that secularism is more promoting of civil rights, liberties, and freedoms than anti-secularism. Now, on to the subject matter of LGBT rights. Much of the same rules and analysis still apply. Just because it is made illegal does not make LGBT cease to exist, and all it does is sweep something under the carpet, so to say. Again, granting rights to LGBT people does not change anything except that they are no longer subjugated to violence, imprisonment, oppression, suppression, criminality, physical and psychological harm. Just like with secularism, whether or not LGBT people have equal rights or not, they still exist, and thus the only thing that changes is they are no longer subjected to actual harm. Then we have the question, does granting LGBT people equal rights cause individual, psychological, societal, or physical harm? The arguments put forward by the anti-LGBT position say that, quote unquote, granting LGBT people equal rights is indoctrinating our kids. Sometimes they say it's teaching our kids that perversion is okay, quote unquote. Sometimes phrased as, quote, teaching our kids to be homosexual, end quote. There are many variations of this argument, but at the core of all of them, it boils down to an assumption of voluntary or choice, or it deals with the facade that humans are not as sexual as they actually are. Example, heterosexual people engage in oral and anal sex as well. Sometimes they assume the position that reproduction will not happen due to too much same-sex sexual action. Again, this is a poor argument as homosexuals already exist, and not granting them equal access to civil rights, liberties, and freedoms does not stop LGBT people from engaging in their sexual practices. Also, I didn't put it in here, but I should have. Homosexuals can still reproduce. The only thing that will truly change is the deficit of actual harm imposed on LGBT people. The, quote, think about the poor children, end quote, argument is an appeal to a motive force. After all, who wants to cause harm to children or take away their observed innocence? The other problem is that of an assumption that it is voluntary or a choice, which I would think at this day and age, do I really have to explain how and why attraction, whether it be romantically inclined or sexual, it is involuntary and not a choice or a learned behavior? I really think it's amazing that in this day and age, after everything, that this still has to be said. That we still have to point this out, that homosexuality is involuntary. Heterosexuality is involuntary. Then you have bisexuality. Sexual attraction in general is involuntary. As I said, LGBT people already exist, so if this were to be the case, chances are everyone will be exposed to it at some point or become aware of its existence. Criminalizing LGBT people will not stop exposure to the fact that they exist, whether they exist in hiding or in plain sight. They exist. They have always existed and will continue to exist. The aspect of freedom in this case reminds me of the notion of so-called freedom espoused by anti-smoking people. The proclamation of, I have the right to go somewhere and not smell your cigarette. Well, it's very entitled. I didn't put that in, but I do want to say that it's very entitled, self-entitled. Is the same notion of, quote, I have the right to go somewhere and not see homoromantic expression, end quote. This is essentially proclaiming that one has the right not to be off-put or offended, which no one can guarantee in life for just about anything. The ethical question behind this is what we find gross, off-putting, annoying, or offensive. The ethical question behind this is what we find gross, off-putting, annoying, or offensive is cause to call it a moral or ethical wrong. That's a question. Is that really how we come to, is that really how we in society want to decipher or where we should get our morality and ethics from? Because it is gross or because you don't like it? Therefore, it should be illegal and punishable. I find the practice of embalming dead bodies to be gross and unbearable, but this does not make embalming bodies a moral or ethical wrong. In fact, it is a societal good, as it lessens the potential of biohazards from decaying corpses. Another thing brought up frequently amongst anti-LGBT positions is also the passing of sexually transmitted diseases. For some reason, anti-LGBT people who position themselves behind this argument seem to think because someone is LGBT, the spread of sexually transmitted diseases is more prevalent, and omit anyone who is promiscuously and unsafely sexually active holds a high risk of contracting sexually transmitted disease. Completely omits them. Funny how, when from the societal view of those that argue this, do not apply the same rule to promiscuous heterosexual males that wish to sow their wild oats all over the place. They are at high risk of obtaining a sexually transmitted disease just as well. It is to imply that LGBT people, for some reason, are more sexually active than heterosexual people. The problem with this is not only is it an assumption, but also it applies the notion of tribalistic or collectivism that is devoid of individual choice, taste, and preference. Just the same as not every heterosexual is promiscuously sexually active, not every LGBT person is either. Some are, some are not. Another thing I find interesting is the concept of treating other self-aware humans as disposable, being a more ethical positive than allowing for two consenting adults making an informed decision to engage in same-sex romanticism or sexual act, be less ethical or moral. So what I'm saying there is that I find it interesting that they see it as a better moral or ethical position to destroy a life than to allow two consenting adults making an informed decision to act upon their homoromanticism or homosexuality. These people who take the anti-LGBT position see killing someone as a better, some people, not all, but some of them see it as a better moral or a moral good, as opposed to allowing homosexual acts to occur. That's weird. So, if somebody's LGBT, you can kill them. That's way better than two people of the same sex having sex. That's kind of strange to me. I can't rationalize that. Which is more ethical? Two people of the same sex being in love or expressing love and attraction through a sexual desire or need, or murdering, oppressing, suppressing, and criminalizing that which is an act with no victim nor speakable harm to an individual, so it boils down to taking life or sex. When levied against each position, it shouldn't be hard to understand that taking the life of a self-aware person is more of an ethical negative than two people having consensual sex, no matter how much you don't like it. Some might argue there is an element of physical harm, specifically in regards to two males participating in homosexual sex acts. For those that think this, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but there really is no evidence of this, and even if there were, the self-harm negative impact would be so minute, it would still fall into the same category of individual choices and bodily autonomy. For example, smoking is worse for one's health than a homosexual act, but the individual's choice to smoke is an individual freedom that must be observed and maintained, and not to mention the breakdown of the human body is not that far off than how the human body breaks down over time anyway. Part of existing is that one day you will not exist. The other aspect of this is those whom hold this position like other positions, those whom hold this position like other positions these types hold, for some reason they do not apply the same logic to the heterosexual counterparts about the only harm societally to speak of is the fallacious propagandist fear-mongering of those whom are on the anti-LGBT position and their conspiracy theories of things like the homo global agenda and the false accusations of indoctrination perpetuated not by fact but rather through fear-mongering and confirmation bias. There is the notion of granting equal rights to LGBT people causes an impingement upon certain types of theologians whom reject the idea of homo-romanticism and pair bonding via their religious indoctrination. This is actually true, that there is a level of impingement. However, I would claim that a religious institution not recognizing same-sex unions is irrelevant, and they should have that right as a private institution. The problem is when same-sex couples are not recognized under a secularist institution or society on the whim of a non-secularist institute that is merely dictating to the rest of society how society itself must be conducted. Some religious institutions will recognize it and some will not. The important part is not that the religious institute recognizes same-sex unions, but that the secularist society recognizes it outside the religious institute. Once again, we circle back around to our initial question, which is, does granting LGBT rights cause intrinsic harm to the individual and society and a means of violence and destabilization? The answer should be clear that if they exist within a society where they possess no legal rights to egalitarianism, nothing would really be all that different should they have equal rights other than LGBT people are no longer victims of violence, stigmatization, inability to gain self-fulfillment via a same-sex relationship, criminalization, and many more. So, to those who pose the position of authoritarian dictatorship, be it white nationalism or Christo-fascism, theocracy, ethno-nationalism, or just straight-up fascism, one cannot hold the position of being anti-authoritarian while pushing for an anti-secularist society, nor can they hold this position by claiming an anti-LGBT equal rights position. People who hold this position like to give a false pretense that the deficit of certain rights, liberties, and freedoms is in and of itself freedom. It's meant to persuade an all or nothing situation when really it boils down to their lack of ability to be tolerant and their desire to control society in the way they want. Hopefully, I have demonstrated they cannot have the society they want, and it is exceptionally impossible. Even during the Dark Ages and the Spanish Inquisition, LGBT people existed, and so did those with differing theological beliefs than the dictated belief, including the lack of belief. Atheism, anti-theism, or nihilism are far older than many realize, with evidence of such philosophy dating back to Greek philosophers that predate all three of the Abrahamic religions. Citations: the Upanishads, which 700 BCE, and Panini, 4th century BCE. The obvious question seems to be, how can taking away or violating civil rights, liberties, and freedoms be perceived as freedom itself? So, I wish I would have gone over this and proofread it first. There should have been some punctuations and maybe some restructuring of some of the sentences. I did start talking ahead of myself at certain points, but I hope that was clear. If it wasn't, just ask. I have this typed out so I can correct it, copy and paste, and hopefully it'll make more sense. But I think that I made the valid point. I was able to get through the whole thing. The point being is that whether you have secularism or anti-secularism, different theologies still exist. Under anti-secularism, you have the persecution of the other theological positions. Under secularism, the only thing that's different is you don't have the persecution, but you also don't have the right to impinge or dictate based on a theological position. Under the LGBT equal rights position, it's pretty much the same. Whether you live in a society that's anti-LGBT equal rights or a society that's pro-LGBT equal rights, under anti-LGBT rights, LGBT people still exist. So the sexual transmitted disease argument, so the what about the children argument, influence argument, all those things, they still exist potentially under the anti-LGBT position or society. They still exist. Although I would argue that a lot of those claims of the anti-LGBT people who push that position, a lot of their claims don't stand to reason and are easy to knock down and debunk. But under a society that's pro-LGBT equal rights, The only real difference is they're not met with violence, oppression, suppression. There's no harm done being to the LGBT people, but under the anti-LGBT society, there is. That's really the only difference. Because, like I said, they still exist under the anti-LGBT society. They're still there. They still participate in homoromanticism, homosexuality. They still do those things. They're still there. They still exist. There's still going to come a point where people are going to be exposed to them. They're going to know that this is a part of the world that they live in. That's going to come to light even under an anti-LGBT equal rights society. But under an anti-LGBT equal rights society, you might have persecution, you have oppression, you have suppression, and you could go all the way up to criminalization, including the death penalty. Under a pro-LGBT equal rights society, well, they're still there. People will become aware of them, etc., etc. The difference is there's no harm being done to the people who are LGBT. No persecution, no criminalization, up to and including death. So, I would say, ultimately, you can't hold the position of being anti-LGBT equal rights and claim to yourself that you're pro-freedom. You're not pro-freedom. Under a society that is pro-LGBT rights, it doesn't mean, very easily, it doesn't mean society is going to collapse. It doesn't mean that children are going to learn this behavior. They can still get exposed to it and see it in the anti-LGBT society. It's not how it works. Many homosexuals are exposed to heterosexuality and have never been exposed to homosexuality, and they just grow up thinking there's something wrong with them because it's never been explained. This tells us immediately it's involuntary, and the fact that I have to say that today, in this day and age, is bizarre. It should be obvious. So, you can't be anti-secularist and be pro-freedom. If you are, you're a hypocrite. You can't be pro-LGBT equal rights and say that you're pro-freedom. Again, you would be a hypocrite. It's all done under the guise of, well, I just don't like it. I don't want to be exposed to it. Well, even under anti-LGBT society, you still get exposed to it. And in that case, that might lead to someone's death. And again, I can't equivocate the death sentence of someone as being a moral high ground to allowing two people of the same sex to have sex and have a relationship if that's what they want. I can't rationalize that. We're not talking about aborting a fetus here. We're talking about a person, a human being that possesses consciousness, self-awareness, autonomy, and definitely has a central nervous system and can totally interpret pain. So, as I look at the Republican Party today, I have asked the question to a good friend of mine, why on earth would I ever consider voting for a party that advocates for these things? Ironically, the party that calls themselves the party of freedom, but advocates for very, very anti-freedom positions. So that's the big question. How is all this push against the LGBT community, against people of color, against the idea of secularism? How is that freedom? Why are we having people buy into this? It's not freedom. It's not. All right, so yeah, I will leave the links to some music and in the description, and I'll leave some of the transcript here in the description as well. And feel free to comment, and hopefully you like, share, and subscribe. But with that, I'm out.